Wonderful good morning to the 9 people that raced into the room. It's fantastic to see you all today. Let us know as you come in into the session, how you're doing. Say hello in the chat, just test your function. We're expecting you to ask a few questions today. So test your chat functionality by saying hello. Tell us where you are dialing in from. Most importantly, I'm really looking forward to the next hour or just under with you and with my 2 fantastic guests for today's session. So let us know where you are. Say hello in the chat. And as you do that, you can select hosts and panelists so we can all interact with your session. So good morning, and to Tesna Drea, who's all the way from Cape Town. Michael Law is in Johannesburg. My good colleague, Georgina, who's a content director at CFO South Africa. She's here. She'll be keeping a beady eye on a lot of the questions that you'll be throwing in the chat. So please do select everyone when you do post a message. But for now, say hello. Tell us where you're calling in from and how's the weather. And if you have any electricity for any good South African, they'll know what that question means with what's been happening lately. So wonderful morning. Automation for good. How intelligent automation can enable your ESG initiatives. So it's really fantastic to have you all. I've got up on my screen my 2 guests. I'll get to them in a minute. I'm going to give it a couple more minutes as people come on to this call. I see John Ross Headbush. John Ross is from IISA. Great to have you also join us. As I said, I'll give it a couple more minutes. We'll probably try and kick off, hit the road around about 5 past the hour. But it's fantastic to see you all coming in. We'll let a few of the stragglers also come in the next couple of minutes. And as we do that, as you come onto this session, say hello. In the chat function, let us know where you are dialing in from. I'll get to introduce our fantastic guests for today's session. And if you are hoping to come to a webinar entitled Automation for Good, How Intelligent Automation Can Enable ESG Initiatives, you've arrived at the correct one. You know how it is with the virtual world. If you're just scrolling around the internet and you stumbled across this session, hang around for the next 58 minutes. You might learn a thing or two. So good morning and welcome. My name is Brian Schwer. I'm the community manager at CFO South Africa, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar brought to you in partnership with our good partners, UiPath. UiPath is a global software company that makes robotic processes automation software, from streamlining processes that help you uncover efficiencies and providing insights to elevating your employees' experiences and giving them more time on value creation. Basically, they make software robots so that you do not have to be a robot yourself. So guess what? Automation has been transformational in areas of economic growth. I'm sure you all know that, with a lot of processes being implemented now in financial systems, in your daily reporting, etc., driving a lot of the industry and the innovation that's happening there. But it shouldn't really stop there, right? Automation can also have a tremendous impact on society and environment, addressing a wider coverage of goals in the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda. I'm sure you've heard all about that. So there's a lot of good stuff that can be done. So I'm hoping that we will be able to get this on the road and give you some insights on how automation for good and what that means and what you can do. And put your hand up if you feel you need some assistance in this space. So in this webinar, I'll have David Wray. David is the president of DFCG International Group and also an ESG lead for the International CFO Alliance. By the way, he's also an author. I found this out while snooping around. The Power of Potential. I'm going to get my hands on that book. I'm also joined by Margareta Mucibabici. She's the UiPath Director of Public Affairs and Social Impact. And I want to start off with Margareta and just ask her how she's doing today.
Thank you so much, Brian. Good to see you again, David, and good to see everyone. I'm very well, thank you for asking. Really excited about our conversation today and looking forward to it. I hope we will get a lot of questions and engagement. So yeah, thank you again for the opportunity.
Awesome, thank you, thank you. Mr. David Wray, how are you doing?
Great, Brian. Thank you for asking. And like Margareta, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with both of you, talking a little bit about what we've been up to and how we're using automation and digitalization for good. And it should be a great conversation. And like Margareta, I would love to see lots of questions, especially difficult ones, because this is the space to ask them and we can chat about them.
Absolutely, difficult questions. I've got just the two individuals that will be able to help you. Or if not, they'll guide you in the right direction. So together they will unpack automation for good. They'll reveal how the Internet of Things plays into ESG management and reporting, and how CFOs and finance professionals at large can prepare for fully digitized ESG reporting and disclosures. So we'll kick off this session with, we'll do a presentation from David, and then I'll go into Margareta. We'll share some insights as well. But I really encourage you, if anything that comes to mind, you have a question, put it in the chat. Let us know if you have any questions and insights or any experiences that you may have come across in this new normal of ESG that's crept upon us in the last couple of years or so. We'll have an opportunity to have a good conversation with David and Margareta towards the end. And I've reserved some time for Q&A, but I really prefer that you ask questions as we go and we can unpack, so we can utilize the whole time to reveal a lot of insights. And as you heard, David asked if you could ask some difficult questions. So I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to ask you, the audience, a difficult question. And just to get a sense of the type of audience we have today, putting up a difficult question for you all in form of a poll. It will come up on your screen and it reads as follows. How would you describe your proficiency in digitizing sustainability information processes? This is currently in your business. I see the first person click the first one. Digitizing information processes. If only I knew what that meant, right? So hopefully you're at the right place. Pretty good. We're actively working on that. Third option is excellent. We're leading up, our peers in this space. Last but not least, we're just starting now our digitization journey, and would like somebody to hold us a hand, let us know some of the ropes. You certainly come to the right place. So those are your 4 options. How would you describe your proficiency in digitizing sustainability information processes? Are you a G? This is in the street lingo, but are you getting there, right? Funny enough, G is represented here by excellent. We are leading our peers in this space, or you are just starting out. Let's see if we can push it up to about 65%. It's a difficult question. Perhaps you can think about it, but I'm sure a lot of you have already started work on some of these things. Again, we are on our journey. We are pretty good. We're absolutely excellent, top of the game, or we are just starting out. If I can push it to 60%, I'll be very happy, and then I'll end the poll. So a couple more, if you can. Digitizing information processes. If only I knew what that meant. Pretty good, excellent, and we are just starting our digitization journey. Almost there. We almost at 50%. I just have that one more person, and I'm going to count down in 3, 2, 1. David, I'm going to come to you. Quite interesting. That's the numbers we're, I was seeing on the screen here. So 37% of the audience here are just starting out, yet, fairly close. Some of us are not really sure, and I'm certainly one of them. What can you get from this information, David?
It's, to be honest, this is quite consistent with what I see in other countries with other CFOs and sustainability leaders. It's usually around 60% that are either not yet started, not really sure how to start, or others are really just at the beginning of their journey. So it's about 60% on average. So what we're seeing is very common in terms of response, which is great because it means that there's a lot that can be taken away from this. For the 20% or so that are excellent and leading their peers, fantastic. From those individuals, I hope we get some great questions and perhaps some examples, because I think, peer sharing is really helpful when it comes to taking these types of journeys, particularly when they're transformational. So not surprised at all. Good news. All of this is uphill from here. Absolutely
uphill. Margareta, I'm going to bring you in just to share your thoughts, and perhaps when clients come to UiPath, are they greenhorns, as you speak? Are they wet behind the ears? Where are they falling? In which area? Are they typically just starting out, or need a helping hand, or got stuck halfway through?
That's a great question. I think looking at the past couple of years, sustainability and combining digital technologies with helping sustainability goals has increased a lot in importance and has become more accessible to everyone, not only the experts in sustainability. So it's becoming more of a horizontal topic that's relevant for all of us. So from a customer perspective, we have seen this topic becoming more and more, brought up in conversations, and there's definitely interest to understand how we can put technology together with sustainability and make sure that technology acts as a catalyst towards sustainable goals. I don't think we know exactly all the possibilities that are out there, but I think it's really important to start. So the results that I have just seen from the poll, I think are, as David said, very representatives for what we also see in practice in our conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said about catalyst, and hopefully, David, as we get into how, you're going to share with us up next, how IoT actually plays into ESG management reporting. So I'm going to leave it with you. You've got a couple of slides that you want to talk us through. So let's have it. Let's see some of the work that you're doing and how we could benefit, and then we will touch base when you're done with your presentation. David?
Yeah, no problem. Let me just get this up. Let me just put it in presentation mode so you can actually see it. This is always helpful. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about today might be a completely different perspective, but it really gets to the fundamental challenges we have when we talk about digitalization of sustainability. And clearly we talk about it in the context of data, but really what we're talking about are the information flows, which is why I think the perspective from Margareta later on with UiPath is helpful, because that's really all about the process that supports that flow. Let me tell you a little bit about what's been happening. I want to give you some numbers. As a finance community, we love numbers because there's nothing better than a metric. And there are three in particular I'm going to point out. You may or may not have heard these before, but hopefully they will cause you to think a little bit differently about the nature of the problem. The first one is $780 billion US per year. Now, that's a staggering amount of money by any measure. What the 780 billion represents a year is it was done by the OECD and UiPath. They basically had a look at the financial services industry globally, and they looked at the cost of compliance for the different regulatory reporting requirements that one bank had in multiple jurisdictions. So because the regulatory requirements are different and there's no mechanism today to connect that, companies have to reprocess that information and set it up in various formats. So this is banks alone, 780 billion US per year spent just doing that. The second number is 4 billion US. So I've given the, 4 billion euros, the 4.5 billion US equivalent, in case you just want a benchmark comparative. Now, you might look at that after I've just told you about 780 billion, say, okay, yeah, big deal, David. What does that really mean? This was a study commissioned by the European Commission, and they wanted to look at the cost of compliance, the incremental cost of compliance on companies in 11 countries over an 8-year period. So again, you might look at that and say, okay, well, that's not that much then if you look at 8-year period in 11 countries. But let me translate that for you into the operating percentage that cost represents. So the 4 billion represents between 2 and 4% of a company's operating expenses. That is massive in just external reporting in terms of how do you disseminate information. So that's the second number. The third number is 600 billion annually, and that again is in US dollars. And this was a study by the Data Warehouse Institute. And what they looked at is they looked at in the US alone, how much do companies spend on managing data quality challenges? They spend 600 billion per year. So again, these numbers are staggering. Now, what we did is there's a large group of us that are actively working on how do we change this conversation and how do we end up looking at driving that cost down for 2 reasons. One is, frankly, it's not actually value-added cost, right? If you think about it, it's simply the cost of disseminating information. So if we can disseminate that information better, we can have it more clearly understood, more clearly discoverable, comparable, and trusted. That money could be repurposed for any sort of public good initiative. So all of this discussion about, look, the cost of transition, if we could save some of that money and repurpose it to transition, we start to change the dialogue, we start to change the game. And this is really what's driving the work that I'm going to share with you a little bit behind and what it means. We had an event in Glasgow at COP26. There was a side event, and basically the event that we put on, I'll tell you really honestly, we expected maybe 12 people because it was talking about digitization, and digitization is not necessarily seen as the most exciting topic by leaders and by stakeholders that are influential. And we thought, okay, maybe 12 if we're lucky. I'll tell you quite honestly, we were at a full house and we actually turned people away. And keep in mind, this was in a restricted environment. We had social distancing requirements at the time, etc. So we ended up moving a significant number of people online, but even then we met capacity. So what did we do? We gave an update on 4 projects, but 2 I think are particularly interesting here. The first one, and again, keep in mind, and you'll probably smile at this as I smile every time I think about it. As finance people, and I'm one of them, I would not describe myself as creative. And that's probably a good thing in my profession. You don't want me to be creative in that context. So the naming convention we had for the projects is literally workstream A, B, C, and D. That's the creativity that we came up with. Workstream A was really looking at data management fundamentals. And again, you might say, but why? Like, we've had lots of time to look at this. We've had SOX in the US, we've had all sorts of governance related issues, internal controls over financial reporting. Aren't we past that? No. The reality is no, we're not. So what we found that there is a real inconsistency, for example, in simple things like naming conventions within companies. If you have a product that moves, for example, from the procurement department that acquire it, through the warehousing system that warehouse it, through the sales department that try to sell it, through the distribution that end up moving it to the client, they often use different references for the same thing. And therefore, the master data that underpins all of this information is not consistent and aligned. There's additional issues around whether or not it's automated from end to end. And what we do when we're thinking about this idea of data management is from the point the data is created or captured, depending on what you want to how you want to refer to it, all the way through its life cycle to consumption. And that's really what we're looking at. Whereas if you think about what the focus has been historically, it's been specific to disclosure. So XBRL is specifically about disclosure. So there's been a lot of focus at one point in time, but not a lot of focus on the whole system. And that's where what we're doing is quite different. And we're saying, look, in order for us to be able to really get decision useful information about any sustainability related topic, whether it's the environment, a social aspect, or governance, it has to be useful. And it has to be something we can discover. Because if the information has been created, but nobody can find it, this is equally unhelpful. So it's about using digitization to make things discoverable, particularly in a public context. It's also about saying, look, the US might require this, South Africa might require this, China might require this, and maybe I'm an entity that has activity in all of those jurisdictions, but I need to be able to bridge gaps. I need to be able to bridge the requirements between and use digitization to do it. And the technical term is referred to as interoperability. I just like to refer to it as creating bridges or connectors between information so that we can effectively develop, therefore, commercial solutions that end up being able to embed this interoperability. And why is that important? Well, it's really important because it drives down the cost of reporting. So remember those numbers I showed you earlier? It will dramatically drive that down. The other thing that it will do, which is probably the most important from my personal perspective, is it creates a more inclusive environment. If you think about the fact that historically, emerging economies, for example, have historically not had access to capital markets in the same way, the playing field around the capital access, amongst other things, has not been level. And companies have been left behind and they've been disadvantaged. So a big part of what we're doing here to make this accessible in everyday software through this interoperability or connector is effectively change that discussion and bring everybody along. So that's what the focus of Workstream A and Workstream B were about. A was really about the data management governance. What does that governance model need to look like? And how do we make sure that we're setting ourselves up so the data that flows from one entity and the supply chain to another, to another, to another follows so that it's structured, it's trusted, and it can just move through the system. That was what Workstream A was all about. Workstream B, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more and show you a diagram for, is where we now started to use technology to help us address these issues and demonstrate how technologies can actually be incredibly helpful in solving this problem. Now, the technologies that we used were knowledge graphs, which basically just show you, if you think about it like this, it basically is a really smart visualization of showing you patterns and connections between various aspects. So what our brain does very quickly, and it can say, well, if you walk in, for example, to a room and there's 100 people, let's imagine you know the 100 people, your brain can connect very quickly the commonalities between those 100 people. Knowledge graphs does the same thing, but does it at massive, massive scale, something that frankly our brains wouldn't be able to do anywhere near as quickly if it could do it at all. So we used knowledge graphs, we combined artificial intelligence or augmented learning, machine learning, depending on what term you want to use, but basically it was machine learning. And we taught the machine. We taught the machine to say, hey, this pattern you've identified actually is not a pattern. It's an anomaly, and therefore you need to recognize it as an anomaly. And hey, by the way, this should have been recognized as a pattern, learn it now. So basically it was a little bit like teaching a child to get smarter and smarter as it went through iterations of the data. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we did in the fisheries, because we use specifically the fisheries use case as an example. And that's where we looked at IoT, and we had some really fascinating findings there. Really briefly, Workstream C and D are all about now saying, okay, how do we make sure that digitization and digital thinking, so thinking about what the output is from a digital perspective, how do we make sure that thinking is with standard setters? So they start thinking in this manner. So if they write a standard, are they thinking about how it's going to be digitized and whether or not it's conducive to being digitized? And we've been working on that with EFRAG in Europe, which is basically the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, basically the standard setter in Europe. We've also been working with the IFRS Foundation, looking at the ISSB taxonomy as part of that, and similarly working with Japan and working with the US, amongst others. So there have been several that have been collaborating there. And the idea has been, how do we define best practice use cases for taxonomy development? So again, we're starting to set the foundation in place so that we can connect in a very consistent way, no matter what policies are decided around the world. So the real beauty to this approach is it bypasses effectively the geopolitical challenges around agreeing on harmonized sustainability standards and says, okay, politically, you go work that out, because standard setting at the end of the day is a fairly political process, and fair enough, different countries have different priorities, but technology is not. So the technical discussions we've been having have been much more straightforward, and we've been making a lot more progress because it's not emotive in the same way. We're just simply trying to connect information together so we can make sense of it. So that's a little bit around what we've been doing. Here's the diagram I promised you. And if you think about this as the intersection between activities on the left-hand side, so in the blue, these are all of the physical things that we do around fisheries, for example. So when I give you some context, we looked at data like cameras that were on fishing vessels. We looked at not just from a identification of the fish species they caught, for instance, but also potentially GPS around where the catch occurred. There are probes that are in the ocean that basically travel around the world in the ocean, and periodically, interestingly enough, they bob up to the surface. When they bob up to the surface, they transmit to a satellite, and all of the data that goes with that around current, water temperature, water composition, etc., all of that forms sources of information. So it helps us assess the health, for example, of fish species and whether or not catches are occurring in regulated manners. So is it an appropriate catch? Are there practices around that catch that need to be addressed, for instance? And are we catching fish in quantities that allow it to replenish itself? Or are we depleting those fish species? So there were all sorts of devices that were effectively capturing this data and became a source of information. Well, the machine consumed that, right? It also consumed taxonomies around fish species. So all of the naming convention, it captured imagery around that so that it could be identified. It captured breeding seasons. It had additional geolocations and the kind of water it was. So whether it was freshwater or it was marine water. And again, this was interesting because the reported catch, for instance, that we looked at was a reporting of 10,000 pounds, for example, of mackerel were caught. And the individual that was doing the reporting said, I caught the mackerel in the Irrawaddy River, and this is my reported. And by the way, I caught it in November, late October, early November. So human being, you look at that, your immediate response is mackerel is a marine fish, Irrawaddy River is freshwater. Okay, both facts, but those two facts don't fit together. So there's the first instance where we can start to say, okay, the machine has recognized there's a problem. But that's not enough. We need to be able to go a little bit further. So the machine then started looking at, well, what are the dominant species of fish in the Irrawaddy River at the location where the catch was reported? And it was able to show the various fish around. And we concluded that the predominant fish species in this example was tilapia. Now you start to look and say, well, why would someone report mackerel as opposed to tilapia? And you start to look at, well, mackerel gets, let's say, $10 a pound, whereas tilapia only gets $7. So now you can start to see there's an economic driver behind things that start to happen. But we also identify that as a data quality problem, right? Because now you've got data being reported that actually isn't what it purports to be. So you've got all of these dynamics playing themselves out. And this is what we effectively were able to demonstrate, that not only is there a data quality problem, but we were able to show how the machine could go on and identify what the more likely data was. And then we were able to go one step further and say, hey, it was caught in breeding season. Actually, it was an illegal catch. So what would happen is that would be flagged up for a human to then go and have a look at and say, okay, now what processes do I need to go back and have a look at? How do I address the underlying issue? And what we did in this drawing as well, so beyond the physical aspects, is on the right-hand side in green, this is the data governance that I talked about a little bit earlier in workstream A. So it's really starting to look at data from various aspects. and looking at how we identify it, how we manage it, how we govern it, and what we do with it. And where it got interesting is you could see the intersection between physical activities produce data. I just gave you the example of the fish, right? And insights are created. So the machine gave us insights around that data. Those insights get fed back into the system to say, well, we need to change our behavior as a result of the insights that we gleaned. And it just becomes this infinity circle, infinity loop, which is why you see the diagram in this way. So there's a very strong connection between physical activities or physical choices or choices in general and how we manage data. And those two things are inextricably linked and will continue to feed into one another. Now, this was important because it helps inform how we end up thinking about any kind of digitization or digital solution. We have to make sure that we're taking into consideration both of these aspects. So it really did come down to, for us, looking back and saying, look, we could do so much all together. And it's not just about one or two of us, it's about a community of people that are passionate about addressing the data, access, quality, trust, accessibility, and being able to put that decision, that information in the hands of citizens so that they can make choices. So we're not passing any kind of view. We don't have a view on what someone should do, simply that you want to empower them with information so they can make a choice around what they want to promote. And if you think about that, I'll give you a simple example. I had a conversation with a team in Nigeria yesterday. We were talking about sustainability there. And the example I gave is, look, imagine you go into a restaurant and you can see that there are two restaurants. Let's say they're side by side. You're walking outside, you're looking at the menu. Let's say there's a QR code. You can literally put your camera up, QR code, and your camera pops up with a screen that gives you all of the information around where it was caught, who caught it, if it was net caught, line caught, whatever the case may be. You actually could then look at that and say, okay, one restaurant is promoting sustainable fishery because they're encouraging line catch. Yes, I realize it may be a little bit more, but this one is actually using practices that don't do that. I'm going to make a conscious choice as a consumer as to which one I go into. And that's the kind of thing we want to do, because today we don't have that kind of information. So we can't even make that decision. So that's a big part of how we get to digitization and automation for good. So let me just summarize and tell you a little bit about where we're going. So what we're doing is we're effectively putting together what we're calling the Digitization of Sustainability Data, or DSD lab. And what is that? Well, basically, it's going to be a single access point where within the context of the platform, we'll end up really focusing on something very specific. So we're not trying to solve every issue, but we're trying to solve the fundamental issue that's leading to the problems that we have today. So we're going to have and develop an accredited taxonomy registry. And what that means is that for every taxonomy that's created, it will go through a verification process for interoperability with all of the other taxonomies. And that's important because it means that when someone gets accredited, the software vendors like UiPath and many, many others can literally build that capability into their products, effectively allowing organizations, SMEs in particular, to access and provide information at scale with minimal human intervention, which again, today is something that remains a little bit of a dream, I think, for us all. But we're also going to focus on controlled vocabularies, right? And controlled vocabulary simply means that we use words in a consistent way to mean the same thing across the board. And if someone else wants to go a little bit further, for example, in how they define materiality, no problem. We'll just create an extension to the definition. And then if another country wants to go to that same place on materiality, great, they take the same definition. So we don't have to keep reinventing what we do. It's a little bit like just using this structured and controlled vocabulary that everybody understands. And then there'll be a body of knowledge to help people and organizations in particular, especially some of the initiatives like the not-for-profit initiatives, help them understand how to think digital, how to embed that into the sustainability initiatives that they have. And if you're sitting there and wondering, hey, David, why is all of this common vocabulary and why is all of this even important? Let me give you a very simple example that all of you can relate to. if you think about taking a flight, now granted, I realize flying over the last couple of years has been elusive for most of us, but just think about any point in time where you've taken a plane in the past. You get on the plane and there's a view that the plane's going to take you from A to B and you're going to get there safely. But why is it that you know you're going to get there safely? Well, you think about the captain, the first officer, the second officer, all of the cabin crew get trained consistently to a very high standard in the same way, have the same expertise, the same training. That's part of it. You think about the dialogue that happens between a cabin crew and the ground air traffic controller. The language is always English. It doesn't matter what area of the world you're flying over, English is the common language for the entire airline industry, regardless of where the airline is registered. Take that one step further. Now let's imagine we hear the words that frankly none of us want to hear, but we hear the words coming out of the cockpit that are like pan, 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 for example. That's simply an indication from the plane to the ground crew that there's a problem, but it's not a disastrous problem. They just need to be prioritized to land, right? And again, this is important because this word means the same thing to every single plane crew and every single traffic controller. So you can see the reason the airline industry is safe and we trust it is because we've got this controlled vocabulary. We've got this consistent training certification approach. And it just shows you how effective it can be. That's the kind of discipline that we're trying to bring into sustainability data management, and subsequently reporting. And as I mentioned before, it's effectively to be able to make sure we're creating an inclusive environment. So that's a big part of what we're doing. So I wanted to share with you just a snapshot of where it's going. There's tons of exciting stuff that's happening. I'm quite happy to share a link that Brian can disseminate later if you want more information or you want to stay connected in the work that we're doing, which Capitals Coalition is hosting. I'm very happy to share that information with you. So with that, Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, David. Some really interesting stuff, and I'm just curious to think about. Perhaps we'll get it from the audience at some stage. Just those use cases and how they transcend and move about from different industries, etc. But very interesting. I mean, you touched on SOX, and I think I should have just another webinar on SOX testing itself, right? But yeah, another thing that really caught my eye there was the use of digitization to make things discoverable, and I think that's really key for the finance professionals that are on this call. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Margareta, and I know that she's going to talk about how automation for good is part of the UiPath's ESG strategy. So you'll probably bring in some of the items that you've touched on and see how they're interpreting it, at UiPath, and that what that means for the greater community finance professionals that are on this call. So Margareta, I've given you some superpowers to share your own screen, so please go ahead.
Absolutely. But before I do that, or while I'm doing it, I just want to say that I think David's presentation is just fascinating. And as he said, it's only probably a Kickstarter, but it's really, really impressive how much can be achieved. So
I remember that you also had a difficult question that you wanted to ask the audience. So before you go, I just want to check if my audience has still got their fingers on the pulse. I've launched a second one while you're getting ready for them to see. I've launched a second question, also difficult question. How is your company deployed automation to support either one of the several of the following areas for your business? Be curious to find out from the audience where you stand. And then we'll get into Margareta's bits, perhaps that will help you kind of think about this as you go forward. So let's see. Let's have a quick look. A couple of options. Are you deploying automation for health and well-being, environment and sustainability, social impacts? None of the above, or something else? Is it other? And I'm curious. Anybody who's putting other, maybe share in the chat where else you're putting it. Please let us know in the chat if you've selected other, where else you are using this. And the none of the above, perhaps for clarity, none above, none at all, or perhaps is an other. So let us know in the chat. Has your company deployed automation to support either one or several of the following areas? Health and well-being certainly looks like it's in the forefront. Environment and sustainability, this is why we're here, and it's coming up quite strongly. Social impact, very closely linked, I think, to the one before, but let's see from a South African context what that means. None of the above, and other. Curious to see if you're saying other, where else? If you're saying none of the above, where else? Or none at all. Margareta, before you start, I mean, you already started to, we're starting to see some variances where they're deploying it. Any insights? I mean, 45% health and well-being, that's where all the bots are sitting.
That's very interesting, and I would love to learn more. I've added in my presentation a few examples of how we think about the automation's contribution to this important topic. But there's no exhaustive list and there's no one size fits all. It's more about the intention and the kind of outcome that you want to achieve. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I can see Jason Stanley on the call. He says, well, transactions for bank and the geo automation, right? So they've got a little creeper bot that's working in the background. If anyone else has selected other, I'd be curious to hear. Environment and sustainability. David, anything sticking out for you?
I think it's really interesting that we've got relatively little deployment of automation to start doing some of this capturing. So I think, we've been historically really focused on financial aspects. So I think Jason put a comment in around the bank to the GL automation. Absolutely. It's been one of the big ones, but that's really, I think, historically been our focus. It'll be interesting to see how we leverage that over, take that learning and bring it to sustainability and put a different hat on, because it does require a different way of thinking. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what Margareta says.
Yeah, so am I. So Margareta, with that, we've got a great foundation. We know where our audience stands. Over to you.
Thank you so much. All right. So again, pleasure to be here. I will talk to you today about automation for good and UiPath's initiative around it and what do we mean by that. And while I'm doing it, it seems that my presentation is stuck, which I don't know exactly why it's happening.
Where's a good bot when you need one, eh?
Let's see if I can stop sharing and do it again.
Perhaps, yes, that's the old and most popular trick. You stop and start, right? You have a crack at it again, and you might have a good chance you can screen share. Usually solves all the problems.
Okay, now it works.
There we go. There you see.
It's just about giving it a try, right? Okay. So automation for good and UiPath, what do we mean by it and what does it actually stands for? So it's our initiative to research, promote, invest in, shape conversations around the role of automation in creating positive impact on employees, on organizations, and the wider society. And it is a very important pillar of our own environmental, social, and governance strategy because as UiPath, we want to make sure that we're making most of this technology and that we're creating the right context for it to help other organizations maximize their impact. But it is also a very important topic for us, and we take it very seriously and as a responsibility to our ecosystem, to the industry members, and to the wider community. And there are two approaches to it that we have laid out at this point. It's essentially two sides of the same coin. It's about how we implement automation so that we create this positive impact. How do we deploy it? What is the readiness, protocol for it? How do we make sure that people have access to skills and training? How do we make sure this gets communicated to people so that they can have access to career opportunities? But at the same time, what do we do with this technology? So what kind of purpose can we give this technology in addition to what we already know works, which is, increased productivity, efficiency gains, cost optimization. But in order to give it this kind of purpose, you need to be a bit intentional about it. And you need to figure out, what are the areas where I can deploy it. And this is basically a snapshot of the areas that we have identified at this point, looking at our own product capabilities and our own, let's say, success stories in the space of sustainability, in general, not only environmental sustainability. So we've been looking at health and well-being, climate and sustainability, and social impact as potential areas for this technology to create positive returns. Again, not only for organizations, but for the wider, let's say, set of stakeholders that an organization interacts with. In terms of what is currently happening at the moment, I also wanted to give a perspective on the skills dimension. It's really fascinating to see that when you keep people at the heart of your automation projects, you have maximized returns because they are happier, they are more engaged, and they participate with an open heart in the work that they do day to day. So this is a very important principle that we advocate for when we think about automation for good, keeping people at the heart of automation projects. And as you can see, it's a research we have conducted with IDC. If you're doing that, 37% of employees can focus on higher value tasks due to automation software technology. So it's really important that we also prioritize where our focus lies, and we can automate what's automatable, and then make sure that the people have more time to dedicate on a higher value task that requires more of our human skills, and not only doing the repetitive work that people don't usually enjoy doing. Now, moving on those three areas that I've mentioned, health and well-being being one of them. This has been absolutely accelerated by the impact of COVID-19. We have been working with our customers and trying to identify solutions to help them tackle the crisis, whether they were private sector representatives or public sector representatives. And we understood that by working closely with them, we can discover so many other use cases for how automation can create this kind of impact on health and well-being, supporting organizations to tackle the crisis, to speed out the rollout of vaccines, to improve medical care, to improve access to medical service, and other things that can be achieved. And this is not, let's say, the traditional approach to sustainability in our conversations, because I'm going to focus more on environment in a minute, but I just wanted to lay out the facts that if we are intentional, we can create solutions to global challenges related to the UN SDGs, because we stick with the UN SDGs in mind when we think about automation for good, and actually make sure that we can have a very important support for our medical staff and for the doctors and for everyone that's working out there to tackle healthcare crises with the help of technologies, not only automation, but automation is our example today. Now, on environment and sustainability, as it was said before, there's so much that can be achieved, and it's I think also a situation where we need to put together more people, more expertise at the same table. If we have only automation experts, we might lack the sustainability expertise, which is essential for creating these kinds of and identifying these use cases. And then, as David was saying, try to understand how we can standardize these things so that it's easier to deploy automation. If we have only the sustainability experts, sometimes they might not know about automation or other kinds of technology that they can help. So facilitating the conversation between these two groups of people, I think it's essential for creating use cases such as this one. And we are working with our customers across, again, public and private sector departments to understand how we can help them in their own environmental and sustainability journey with the help of automation. And I think we're only scratching the surface here, because it's more than just reducing the paper trail. This is very important. And even if it's a common, let's say, thing that we usually mention when we talk about digital transformation in general, it can have massive returns. Then we were talking about, ESG data, absolutely. And as David was saying earlier, I was just reading a report from Deloitte. I think it was published a few months ago. This is one of the top challenges, right? Data availability and quality. It's a main challenge for organizations all over the world in their disclosures. So making sure that we can deploy technology to also help tackle that challenge, I think is essential for the entire process. From where to start and then to how we process it and how do we leverage it and how we make more informed decisions. And then we can get also a bit more creative and thinking about, okay, how can we, lower our carbon footprint with the help of informed decisions, but also technology that makes us aware of what we consume and what we're doing in this space. And then again, improving waste management, for example. These are the kinds of use cases that require also this kind of sustainability expertise coupled with technology capabilities and expertise to make things happen. And I think it's a really interesting space that we are currently exploring. And then on social impact, it's again, I think, important to remind ourselves that we can create more inclusive workplaces and we can be more connected to the community if we also leverage the resources, the skills, and let's say the time we got back with automation to help our community. And we can do that in all sorts of ways. We can, for example, think about how we can support like nonprofits that need this kind of technology to help enable them in their own mission, help them increase their own capacity. But at the same time, they're also very, very exciting and interesting use cases for how technology can actually create more inclusive workplaces, improve accessibility, whether it's visual, motor, mobility, or auditory. And I've laid out here to the right some examples in that sense. By coupling all sorts of technologies together, we can actually make the workplace more diverse, more easier and friendlier to use by everyone that is involved in the workplace. And we should not forget that, again, we can also help create jobs and career paths with the help of this mindset. And to the right here, there's an example for a collaboration that we have with Autonomy Works, where we create for people with neurodiversity accessible pathways to skills so that they can get trained on automation and have actually a job in this field. So this is something that is currently happening and can happen at a wider scale if we are intentional about it. And last but not least, I also wanted to say that this is actually currently happening. So it is, I think we're at the beginning of the conversation. There is so much more that can be done, but I think it's also important just to acknowledge what is currently happening and be thankful for that. And here is again some stats from a study we have with IDC. And at the moment, 1 in 5 European organizations, we have looked at Europe in this particular case, that are currently using automation technologies, they are already targeting them to address sustainability challenges. So this is work in progress. Hopefully in 1 or 2 years, we're going to see 2 in 5 or 3 in 5 and maybe 5 in 5, and it's going to be, on the corporate agenda for everyone. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's already progress being made in this direction. And with the Automation for Good initiative, this is actually our mission with it. It's very close to UiPath, and we want to make sure that we're shaping a conversation. We're bringing people together to have these kinds of conversations to stimulate innovation, and then actually create use cases that can be taken up by organizations all over the world and tailored for their own needs. Also start a thinking process behind. I also wanted to add the fact that together with IDC, we have also developed a tool, a lead generation tool, in the sense that it's capturing your interest for automation and how you can leverage it for good. And then you can also get access to a personalized report for how you can make this thing happen within your organization, within your own workplace. What is it, the vision that you can bring together, and how can you manifest it inside with actual recommendations and explicit advice for you as an employer within your team?
Awesome. Thank you for that. And with that, questions are already streaming in, Margareta. I mean, there's one that that was popped onto me from Sinan. He says, in the health sector, would RPA application be useful in digital examination of patients? And the suggestion here is in this way, it can delay time for examination. Hospitals can be reduced specifically to clinics. What are your thoughts? Can RPA technology in this instance be used on patients? Can you hear me, Margareta?
No, sorry. Can you say that? I
Oh,
think I have some connectivity issues. Can you please?
Sure, no problem. I'll read out the question. It was posted in to me from Zenan. It talks about the health sector. In the health sector, would RPA application be useful in digital examination of patients? What have you seen?
It depends, because it's also really about the process that you're deploying automation into. So we have seen a lot of examples, for example, in appointments and making sure that, people have faster access to, their services through streaming appointments. But in the process of examination, I think it's really about working together with the healthcare organization to understand where this technology can help speed up things, and then be very careful with how you are implementing it so that everything is very compliant from a privacy perspective. You're mitigating any risks that might happen in this process of deployment, and figure out the best solutions for the patient and also for the person that's doing the examination.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. And I encourage you all to keep those questions coming. David, did you want to come in?
I'll add maybe one thing. What I've seen to the question that Sinan asked, I've seen more intelligent technologies being used in healthcare, right? And they tend to supplement the doctor's diagnosis so that process happens faster, and therefore you can get the person moving through the system faster. And I think Margareta is 100% correct. The technology has to be deployed in the right area for the right thing. Otherwise, there are unintended consequences, which could be, in this space in particular, quite disastrous for the individual. So I think a lot of thought needs to go into healthcare and how automation ends up working in parallel with healthcare professionals as opposed to necessarily replacing them. Because I think it's a joint partnership at the moment. I don't see it personally, I don't see for the foreseeable future that it becomes entirely automated. I think there'll still be very much a human aspect to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, I'm going to stay with you and just delve back onto our sustainability reporting. What recommendations do you have as we reach the tail end of our conversation to CFOs? What can they do right now to prepare for sustainability reporting?
It's a good question. And honestly, it really is get a handle of the data and start thinking about how you move data for sustainability into a governance model like we have for ICFR, and do so as quickly as you can. So at least start to bring some structure and some governance around it. And then I think the second step is extend this idea that I talked a little bit about earlier, which is the master data, and really start thinking about the data in the context of the company and work to increase the quality of it. So make it a shared deliverable, if you will. So it's not just a finance function, it must be a shared responsibility, because finance tend to be custodians of information, but they don't necessarily create it. They tend to be the recipient of. So I think the CFO has a leading role to play in raising this awareness and working with the other functions as partners. So if they can start doing that now, they'll be significantly ahead when this automation comes to pass and the reporting becomes a requirement in 2 or 3 years' time, depending on the jurisdiction.
And Margareta, talking about some of these challenges, it's often very difficult. So I'm coming back to you. What do you think is the biggest challenges that companies are facing in making this informed decision?
I think it's about the data quality and availability. To be honest, I think this is the biggest challenge that we're currently facing, but this can be resolved. So I think there's some bad news and some good news in the sense that this is something that lies in our control and we can do something about it. And the second one, I think it might be also the need to, as I was mentioning during my presentation, the need to bring more people together with various expertise and stimulate a discussion towards that sense. Because if we remain in our own silos, then we might miss out on really important opportunities that can help actually organizations transform. So I think this is something again that we can do about and shaping more, spaces for conversation. And very briefly to the point on the assessment that we did with IDC that I was mentioning earlier, this was again one of the recommendations that we are making for everyone that wants to have, a word to say in these kinds of projects. Talk to other people, talk to the sustainability experts at your company, talk to the CSR experts at your company. Communicate, shape a vision that you can then communicate to others, create hackathons, celebrate your achievements. And I think, again, communication and dissemination of success and of what's happening is really helpful for everyone to see the art of possible, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly is a communal solution to get this right. David, some closing remarks as we wrap up our show today.
I would just say, don't wait to start this journey. I would say start right now and start really getting a handle on what you have, what you don't have, and what you need to get, and start thinking about how you bring it into a managed and a manageable process. So that would be my parting advice. And the second piece I'll give to that really quickly is get involved in providing feedback to the ISSB, for example, on their sustainability standards, or Europe, if you do business in Europe, get active, start telling them the challenges you have, provide them suggestions and ideas so that we can make sure that standards that are set globally are inclusive.
Absolutely. And there you have it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure for you joining us in this session. It is automation for good, a lot of cool stuff that you can use RPA to do some really good work out there. I want to thank Margareta Mucibabici for joining us from UiPath. And if you need to reach out to us or to her, please let me know. You have all my details in the back end. A very special thank you again to David Wray from DFCG International Group for joining us today. Thank you very much, the two of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. And to the audience, have a wonderful afternoon wherever you are. Afternoon is coming at some point. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.